I hear through the grapevine that your hand plane won't take a shaving. No. And when it does, it just produces crepe paper or dust. Well, there are some fundamentals you need to know about your hand plane if you are to produce some golden locks. Nice curly shavings, you know. Well, this happens to be a Stanley Bailey number 4. And the reason why I've chose this plane is because probably the most common plane you're going to find. It's the one that everyone seems to buy first for some strange reason, instead of the number 5 or the 5.5. But there you go, everyone to their own. But you see, it is a useful tool. Not much good for truing a board, unless it's very short, but it is good for smoothing a board, especially if you've actually honed your plane iron correctly, put a bit of a camber on it maybe. Well, what causes the hand plane not to produce a shaving? Well, first of all, let's have a look a little bit closer, shall we? Let's take the old lever cap off. There we go. There's a lever cap. Excuse the muck because I've been using it. This is my user, yes. Now, this is just the original lever cap and plain iron assembly. Now, this one's actually set a bit too far away, to be honest. I normally set this around 1 to 3 millimeters. It's probably just over 3 millimeters at the moment from the edge. Now, some people say, oh, you've got to get as close as you possibly can. That's your first mistake. You don't want the chip breaker, which is this piece here, too close to the actual edge of your plane iron. No, the bevel. No. That is your first mistake, if that's what you're doing. I'll explain in a moment, so bear with us. So I tend to have it, about 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters back, around that, so between 1 and 3 millimeters. That is okay. That's fine. You don't have to be right up to the edge. No. As long as you're not too far away, because if you're too far away, it's actually not going to do anything, is it? No. So that'll be okay. About 2 millimeters from the actual edge of your plane iron, the bevel. Okay? So that's probably at 2.5 mil. But that's fine. I'm happy with that. Now, the first thing you need to check, well, this is the second thing. I suppose the second thing you need to check is the position of your frog. Right? What bit's the frog, you're going to say? Well, the frog is this piece here, because it looks kind of like, I don't know, does it look like a frog? I suppose it does, but that's why we call it a frog. Right? Look like a frog's face, isn't it, like Kermit. So, that is the frog. Right? Now, if the frog isn't correctly positioned, your plain iron assembly ain't going to be correctly positioned either. No. Now, what I do is I grab myself a little steel rule like this, and I place it on top of the frog, the machine face of the frog, and move it down to the mouth. And if it feels like it's got some sort of resistance at the bottom here, okay, let's bring it a bit closer so you can see what I mean. Just there, right, where the mouth is of this hand plane. If it's hitting that, in fact, that one is a little bit. That is slightly wrong. Very slightly, okay? Your rule must feel like it was just skimming over it. You don't want it so far away that you miss it, or too far back so you're hitting it. At the moment, it's hitting a little bit there, but not there. So really, I need to readjust this, so we'll do that now. So, I'm going to loosen these 2 screws. There's one there, okay? Right? And then there's one on the other side as well, just like slightly loose. To be honest, they are actually quite loose anyway. That might be part of the problem. Maybe it's wiggled its way out of alignment. Maybe it's gone a bit skewy because it's loose. And I'll grab my rule, and if it slides over and just kisses it, just kisses that edge of the mouth there. Right, when I say the mouth, I'm talking about the slot in the bottom of your hand plane. Okay, so it's the back face on the top of the slot. So that basically must not influence your plane iron, and also you mustn't have it too far forwards, because that will cause you problems regarding the shaving being able to freely escape. So that's okay, and that's okay. So now I need to tighten these 2 screws. So I don't over tighten them, and that's probably why you come loose. But you just want my hand tight. You don't want to break it. I'd rather have to readjust it than break the plane. All right. So that feels okay. Let's just double check that. Was it pulled too far down again? No, it's pulled too far down again. I need to bring it forward a little bit. All right. So I'm gonna loosen them again. And there's another screw that you need to be aware of. And at the back here, we have this adjustment screw in the back here. And that basically sets the fixed position for the frog to and forth. So in this case, I need to bring it forwards just a touch. Okay, and then I can tighten it. I'll screw it down a little bit. Just check it. And then I'll tighten it in a second. Like I say, not too tight. Then you bring the rule down, and if it's still been influenced by the mouth, this side's pretty good. This side's still a little bit. It's sticking there. You see, it's just sticking as it's hitting that part of the mouth there, the top of the casting. So I need to loosen that screw a little bit again on the frog, and that one on the frog. And then just tighten that just a touch. We're talking about, and that's whisker hair. We're not talking about a lot. I don't want to more than that. I think I might have done it. So the thing is, you see, how to explain this? The screw here has a bit of free play. In other words, where the slot that screw goes onto this little yoke, this little adjuster plate here, there might be a bit of slack in it. So if you loosen it, you need to tighten it again, just a touch. Okay, just bring it like a turn, just until you feel it engaging. Otherwise, this frog can eventually slide back up against that adjuster plate just there. So you need to make sure there's tension on it before you actually tighten these screws up. And I've already done that, so just tighten these up a little bit. That should be okay. And now hopefully the rule lines up perfectly, which it does. I'll try and explain a little bit. Yes, that's perfect now. Okay, see, if you understand what I mean, that rule now travels over into that mouth, over to the mouth that side, but it's not too far forward that it causes a problem. So, what do I mean by that? Okay, I do have a blackboard here. Let's try and scribble on there, shall we? Right. So, my point being that you have the sole of your hand plane with a slot with the blade that has to protrude out of. So, the blade itself, you've got your, so let's say for that frog, let's say that's the frog there, right? That's the frog, which is adjustable. That's the frog. The plain iron assembly sits on top of that frog. But then you have the thickness of the sole. That's why this is really getting a bit tricky now. It was a moth with a chalk. So you've got the thickness of the sole here, like so. And if that frog protrudes over the bottom of the casting of the hand plane, so that's representing this area here, and that's protruding too far forwards, the blade itself will be influenced by the sole of the actual plane itself, and it'll push the plane iron too far forwards. And if it's too far forwards, okay, it will reduce the gap between the blade, this representing the blade. Hang on, tell you what I've got here. Use this one. Got another assembly here there. Alright, so if we place that there like so, if that's too far forwards, we've made the gap here in front of the blade, in the mouth, smaller. So there won't be enough room for the shaving to even come through properly, especially if you're taking a heavier shaving. And if that is too far back, the frog that is, the bottom of the sole will influence the plane iron, instead of coming through nice and in line, it will try and bridge it. That'll bridge it. That'll bridge it between this area here and the bottom area here, and that'll all be free space behind. There'll be a big gap behind it, which clearly is not really going to be good enough. You see, no, because it's just going to be floating about like that. That's not right. And also, it's going to be trying to rest on the bevel. It needs to be resting on the back of the actual plane iron itself. Now, this happens to be a Victor hand forged plane iron assembly with a Clifton chip breaker, which is a much better thing than these Stanleys, as you can probably tell. You know, but then again, they come at a different price point. So that's one thing you've got to watch out for, okay? Because obviously you don't want to restrict the mouth to a point where the shaving cannot pass through. And also, you don't want to influence the actual plane iron. The other thing you need to be careful of, and that's actually on the chip break and plane iron assembly itself. If we remove that again, it's not just whether or not that is an okay distance from the actual bevel or your micro bevel, the sharpened edge. No, it's not just that. It's clearly obviously very important. Well, is it really? As long as it's not over 3mm and not under 1mm, you'll be fine. This area here needs to marry up with your planer, which this needs to be run over the oil stone really, or a diamond sharpener, and flattened off. It looks a little bit shitty at the moment. Now that chip breaker must fit perfectly along the back here. Otherwise, what happens is the shaving comes along, it will go between the chip breaker and the plane iron. And that's what happens when you end up with like a load of shaving and stuff all gets stuck around here and all gets gunked up, and you can't well, at that point you will not be producing the shaving at all. It will just produce dust. And it will get trapped in there and you've got to take it out and clean it all up. Now, that's exactly what will happen if the chip breaker is too far forwards. Okay? If it's too far back, you won't create a curl on your shaving. You won't be breaking the fibres in the shaving, which means you'll be splitting the wood as you're taking the shaving, which obviously is no good either. You just end up with an awful torn finish. You get tear out, basically. The chip breaker is really, really important. It has a specific job to do. It creates the curly shaving, which prevents tear out with your hand plane. Don't eradicate it, but it will help prevent it. So, you've got to bear that in mind. You've got to make sure that's nice, snug fit across here. There's no nicks and, and it's, it's perfectly in line. The other thing is, when these plain iron chip breakers, these they lose their tension, if that makes any sense. You see, at the moment, you can see there's a little gap formed behind here. If your chip breaker assembly is, let's say, for instance, you've got hasn't got a very good marriage between the plane iron and chip breaker assembly along this edge, but also if there's no gap there at all here, that with this sort of sprung steel arrangement, what will happen is there'll be no tension there. And if there's no tension there, no matter how well you made that true and married, so meet together properly, it won't matter because there'll be no tension. So effectively you can flex out of the way. So that's quite important. This one's getting a little bit, I'd say, a little bit tired. Now you can correct it, but with a little bit of brute force. But then you've got to be careful what happens here. Because the more times you true this edge of the actual chip breaker, not the plane iron, but the chip breaker, the less material there is to make contact with the actual plane iron. And then this gap here will reduce further. And the tension will reduce further, no matter how tight you have that screw. So that is something that can cause, well, pretty rubbish shavings, in fact. Where the plane just keeps clogging up. And it's very frustrating, it really is. Now, another thing That can cause a problem, but it's less likely as if the sole of your hand plane is not true. Now this one probably could do a bit of TLC, but this is my user. This is, this is fairly original. It is original. It is what it is. Okay, and it goes. It's one that's been in the tool bag, and over the years, and it's been a good little tool. And now it actually lives in the workshop. It's a rig, do a rough refurb and tidy up really. But it is a good tool. It's still a good user, even with its silly old 2mm thick plane irons, which I don't like. But there you go. So what we've covered here so far is the frog position, the chip break and plane iron, whether or not your sole is perfectly true and flat. If there's a void here, a hollow in this area, there's a distinct possibility you're not going to take a very good shaving because you're bridging the mouth of the plane. So you've obviously watched that. That's it. A hand plane this size is really easy to flatten with a piece of sandpaper on something that's really flat. Just take it easy, step by step. Okay, so that was flat sole, chip breaker, frog, got to be in the correct position, but not only that. This happens to be a Bailey, a Stanley Bailey. Okay, now Stanleys tend to have a fairly thin, plenty strong enough. Don't get me wrong. So the front of the mouth of the actual, sole, this area here, with this bridge arrangement here, this casting, is fairly thin. So when the shaving comes out, there's nothing here to create an obstruction. Yeah? Now, if, for instance, you've got a Chinese or Indian-made hand plane, such as a Faithful or something like that, you might need a bit of a bit of TLC to make that hand plane work flawlessly. Now, the reason why I say that is because I had a rider. It was an Axminster rider hand plane, which I gave my son. And it didn't take a very good shaving. One of the reasons for that was this area here of the sole was too thick. So it was almost vertical here, which created an obstruction for the shaving. So as the shaving was trying to curl, it was causing that obstruction. It also effectively narrowed the mouth of the hand plane, which provided it with less room. The other problem with that particular hand plane, and something you might want to bear in mind with your Stanley Bailey or any of them, in fact, that the lever cap or screw cap, whatever type of cap you got, doesn't cause an obstruction. Now, this rider hand plane that I was talking about, the lever cap, when it was mounted into the hand plane, instead of being like this one, which is about there, okay, which doesn't really cause too much obstruction there, does it? No. The shaving can come over and then start curling. But with the rider hand plane, which was one of the Axminster, older Axminster hand plane, rider, made in Asia somewhere, the actual lever cap was positioned about there. Like that. Now, it's obvious what's going to happen. The shavings would get caught underneath here, and then they'll ruck up on themselves, so that they'll pleat, effectively, instead of actually curling. So although the chip breaker sort of does a job, but it kind of creates this weird concertina sort of shaving, and then it clogs the hand plane, just because that's too far forwards. So bear that in mind with your hand plane. If that ain't sitting on top of your chip breaker, like so, there's a distinct possibility it's going to provide an obstruction. Now, with a little rider hand plane, what I did in the end is I literally had to cut off about 4mm off the actual lever cap until it got to this part of the casting and had leave enough meat there, and then it was fine. It works perfectly fine now. So these things can be fettled to some degree, but there again, let's be honest, it should be working perfectly right from day one, shouldn't it? Really, I can't understand where companies, even in China or India, what have you, will make something that is just fundamentally wrong. I don't know how even they've even managed to do it, to be honest. So anyway, if your hand plane is not taking a shaving, or it's rucking up, clogging up, causing you all sorts of grief, bear my little points to mind. It might be one of those points that I pointed out, if you know what I mean. So, I have to admit, I do still love the Stanley Baileys. They're simple and they just work. They're tried and tested design, and you can still pick them up for okay money. Or maybe Grandpa's got one hidden in his attic somewhere or in the garden shed, just sitting there waiting to be restored. Well, you'd ask, don't you? Anyway, I hope that was useful and you found that of interest. Please. Oh, what's happened there? That moth that has just died on me. Oh, poor little moth. It's a blue one as well. Anyway. Yeah, please hit the like button and maybe subscribe to the channel. Maybe a little bell icon, because then you get one post in your pocket every time I upload another video. Well, yeah, they are pretty cool. But I suppose it would be better if it had a decent plane iron like that one, to be honest. Maybe that's another project, eh? Well, toodaloo. And what plane irons do you prefer? Was that a stupid question? There isn't many to choose from, really, is there?